Plaintiff calls Dr. Will Hawkins.
Good morning, Dr. Hawkins. I remind you you're under oath.
Yes, sir.
You may proceed.
Good morning. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good morning. I'm Dr. Will Hawkins.
Dr. Hawkins, why are you here today?
I was retained by Midland's Television Studios to analyze how Danny Kosak's selection and training of Elias the chimpanzee affected the events of June 29th.
Can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
I hold a PhD in animal science and primatology from The Ohio State University.
Did you continue your research after leaving Ohio State?
Yes, actually. After I left The Ohio State University, I got a faculty position at Midland State. Now I chair the Department of Anthropology, teaching and continuing my research into primate ethology.
What's primate ethology?
It's kind of a give me grant money word for the study of primate behavior.
Dr. Hawkins, what materials do you generally rely upon to come to your conclusions?
I rely upon evidence and sworn eyewitness testimony. This gives me information about the animal, how the animal was trained, and the events leading up to an attack.
How do you use and analyze these materials to help reach a conclusion?
I compare and contrast what the trainer did do with what the trainer should have done, according to the literature and prevailing expert opinion.
And are these methods and materials standard for experts in your field?
Yes, they are.
What methods and materials do you look at for today's case in particular?
I reviewed the deposition of Alex Grace, the star of MTS, as well as Danny Kosak, the chimpanzee's handler. I also read the affidavits of two other eyewitnesses also present at the attack. Key evidence I reviewed included a blueprint of the set and the safety guidelines that Kosak provided.
We'll talk about all of that in just a minute, but before we do, can you just tell us a little bit more about chimpanzees?
Pan troglodytes, the common chimpanzee, is one of 8 species of great ape. I always like to tell my students, think of Michael Jackson. Remember that monkey he had, Bubbles? Well, that was actually a chimpanzee.
Does that mean that chimpanzees are safe animals?
Absolutely not. Despite the example set by Mr. Jackson, chimpanzees are incredibly dangerous. They've got sharp teeth, sharp canines. They are, pound for pound, a fully grown chimpanzee is 1.5 times stronger than an adult man. But the biggest danger that comes with chimpanzees is the startle reaction.
What's the startle reaction?
You see, when in an unfamiliar environment such as a stage, the new stimuli, like bright lights and unknown people, may make the chimpanzee startled and physically agitated. Now, once that happens, the chimpanzee will begin searching for perceived threats, and if it identifies one, it's going to have a fight or flight response.
Can you explain what you mean by a fight or flight response?
Well, it's exactly how it sounds. The chimpanzee will either fight the perceived threat or try to run away.
Dr. Hawkins, did anything in your research for this case lead you to believe that Elias the chimpanzee experienced a startle reaction on June 29th?
Yes, actually, everything. All 4 of the eyewitness accounts that I read suggested the animal experienced a startle reaction prior to the attack. I believe the animal then perceived a threat and chose to fight, leading to the tragedy that brings us all here today.
Is the startle reaction preventable?
Well, it's a natural defense mechanism, so no, not entirely. That said, there are well understood precautions trainers should take in selecting a chimpanzee and training that chimpanzee appropriately to make sure things get violent less often. Yeah, I actually brought along a demonstrative aid that might help keep track of all of these.
Your Honor, may this witness step down to make use of a demonstrative aid?
Any objections?
Just permission to move to see the demonstrative.
Certainly.
Now, you mentioned certain precautions. Let's talk about selecting first. What should a trainer be looking at when selecting a chimpanzee?
Trainers must take into consideration the age of the chimpanzee, its gender, and its prior exposure to humans.
All right, we'll take those one by one. We'll start with age. What should a trainer be looking at when considering age?
Well, chimpanzees begin developing the physical characteristics that make them dangerous at around 5 or 6 years old. So, trainers want to select a chimpanzee under the age of 5. That way, an infant chimp can't really do any damage, even should it choose to fight.
Did Danny Kosak choose a chimpanzee under the age of 5?
No, he didn't. Kosak sent a 10-year-old chimp, fully developed muscles, teeth, and canines, out onto stage.
What about gender? What should be done when considering gender for a chimpanzee?
Trainers should select a female chimpanzee. Females have less muscle mass and display less aggressive behavior than males.
Did Danny Kosak select a female chimpanzee?
Again, he did not. Kosak chose to use a male.
And how about that last component, prior exposure? What should be considered when thinking about prior exposure for a chimpanzee?
Now, it might seem a little counterintuitive, so bear with me, but you actually want a chimpanzee with limited prior exposure to humans.
Why would you want a chimpanzee with limited prior exposure to humans?
Well, we know that chimpanzees are far stronger than us, but luckily, they don't understand that, at least not right away. But as a chimpanzee spends more time around humans, it starts to realize, hey, these guys aren't all that scary. Actually, they might be scared of me. Eventually, a chimpanzee will learn to recognize its physical superiority.
And how does prior exposure relate to the startle reaction?
Well, when that chimpanzee makes the decision between fighting or fleeing, if it's been around humans long enough to know how strong it is, it's more likely to choose to fight.
And what did Danny Kosak do with prior exposure?
Kosak's animal had been around humans for at least 3 years while it was developing into an adult. That's plenty of opportunity for it to recognize its own strength.
Dr. Hawkins, I'd like to talk about that second precaution you mentioned, training. What should be considered when training a chimpanzee?
Well, the gold standard is what's known as operant conditioning.
What's operant conditioning?
Oh, well, it's a bit technical. I actually have an activity I use to keep my undergrads awake during this lecture. If I could borrow you and Miss Caftall? So, Miss Arvind will be our handler, and Miss Caftall is our chimpanzee. Now, let's say Miss Arvind wants her chimpanzee to learn how to shake hands using operant conditioning. The best way to make that happen is positive reinforcement.
What's positive reinforcement?
It's when the desired behavior gets rewarded. And Miss Arvind, would you take these peppermints? Studies have shown peppermints are an effective study aid, so I like to keep them around for my students, anything to keep them off the streets. So Miss Caftall will shake Miss Arvind's hand, and every time she does that, Miss Arvind will give her a peppermint. Now this forms a cognitive link in Miss Caftall's mind between performing the action and receiving the reward, and that's going to incentivize her to keep performing the action.
Did Danny Kosak use positive reinforcement in training that chimpanzee?
He did. But I'm afraid it's not quite that simple. In terms of the startle reaction, the schedule of training matters even more than the form of it.
What do you mean by the schedule of training?
Well, what we've just showed is a continuous schedule. But say Miss Caftall shakes Miss Arvind's hand. And this time, Miss Arvind is going to wait until about the third shake to give the reward. This is what's known as a partial schedule. And in terms of the startle reaction, it's far safer than a continuous.
What is a partial schedule?
Only rewarding the behavior part of the time. Thank you, Ms. Capital. You've been an exceptional chimpanzee.
Dr. Hawkins, how does the partial schedule limit the startle reaction?
The partial schedules engage the same areas of a chimpanzee's emotional brain as that would normally be active during a startle reaction. But since those areas are already occupied, it's far less likely, if possible at all, that a startle reaction can occur.
And did Danny Kosak adequately adjust the chimpanzee to a partial schedule?
No, he didn't. Kosak started and ended with a continuous schedule.
So when it came to selecting a chimpanzee, did Danny Kosak do what he should have done?
No. Because of these choices, Kosak's selection of Elias the chimpanzee made it far more likely and more dangerous for the chimpanzee to choose to fight.
When it came to training a chimpanzee, did Danny Kosak do what he should have done?
He did not. Kosak's failure to properly adjust the animal to a partial training schedule made it substantially more likely for a startle reaction to occur.
Dr. Hawkins, did Danny Kosak do what he needed to do in order to handle this dangerous, wild animal?
Absolutely not.
Thank you, Dr. Hawkins. I have nothing further. May the witness return to his seat. Dr. Hawkins.
Thank you.
Opposing counsel can leave the demonstrative up.
You may proceed when ready.
Good morning, Dr. Hawkins.
Good morning. Would you care for a peppermint?
Yes, please.
There you go.
Now, I want to start by talking a little bit more about some of these guidelines you mentioned.
Sure.
Now, you started talking about age, correct?
Correct.
And the reasoning for this less than 5 number has to do with the age that monkeys go into puberty, right?
Sort of. It's the age they begin developing their canines and their claws. That actually happens a little before the onset of puberty.
But then this age is, or then their physical characteristics begin to change with puberty, correct?
Sure, but not necessarily those ones that make them dangerous in the first place.
However, puberty is a large factor in determining a safe age for a monkey, isn't that right?
No, not necessarily.
Well, but Dr. Hawkins, you state in your report that a monkey pre-puberty and post-puberty exhibits different physical characteristics, correct?
That's correct.
And that factored into your conclusions you made in today's trial, correct?
The onset of Elias's age of puberty did not have any bearing on my conclusions, no.
However, those characteristics change as the monkey ages, correct?
The sharp nails and claws develop at age 5 before puberty and remain there.
Now, you would say that humans develop at different paces, correct?
Sure.
And the same could also be said about chimpanzees, isn't that right?
Yeah, I suppose so.
So, not all chimpanzees hit puberty at the same time.
No, they don't.
And not all chimpanzees have the same physical characteristics for their age, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the only way you would be able to tell exactly the characteristics a chimpanzee was exhibiting was by observing them, isn't that right?
No.
But the only way you could tell exactly what characteristics a chimpanzee had was by observing them, isn't that right?
No.
Well, now, Dr. Hawkins, you just stated that physical characteristics vary by chimpanzee, isn't that right?
Sure.
And so the only way you could know exactly what physical characteristics a specific chimpanzee has is by observing that specific chimpanzee, isn't that right?
Again, no. Using the case of Elias in particular, I had sworn eyewitness testimony from 4 accounts, one of which being his handler. I had no need to examine Elias, and that can be extended to multiple chimpanzees. You don't really need direct observation to understand their physical state.
Well, no, that's exactly right, Mr. Hawkins. You didn't observe Elias exactly, right?
I had no need to.
You relied on other people's observations of Elias, isn't that right?
That's correct, one of which was his trainer.
But you never actually observed Elias, isn't that right?
No, unfortunately, Elias was euthanized months before I was retained.
Now, I want to move on and discuss this startle reaction that you brought up on direct. Now, a trainer can drastically reduce the likelihood of a startle reaction by training them in conditions similar to what they might experience on a TV set, right?
Yes, exactly.
And that includes exposing them to bright lights,
Correct.
loud noises.
Correct.
But even a chimpanzee that has been trained in those conditions can still have a startle reaction, isn't that right?
Yes, since it's a natural defense mechanism, it's not entirely preventable.
And when a chimpanzee starts having a startle reaction, they're supposed to be given space, correct?
Yes, because if they perceive that threat, then they'll proceed to the fight or flight response.
And all possible threats must be reduced, right?
That's correct.
And that includes loud noises,
Yes, it does.
sudden gestures,
Yes, it does.
and touching the chimpanzees, isn't that right?
Absolutely. That is the number one no-no.
In fact, the only person that should and could touch the chimpanzee in a startle reaction is the trainer, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And all other people would be perceived as a threat to that chimpanzee, correct?
Not entirely. During a startle reaction, even the trainer can be perceived as a threat. In fact, in this case in particular, I believe that Alex Grace, Danny Kosak, or one of the writers on the set all could have been the perceived threat.
So now, you reviewed several eyewitness statements for today's trial, isn't that right?
Yes, I did.
And isn't it true that in multiple of those eyewitness accounts, they report seeing Alex Grace reach out and touch that chimpanzee?
The affidavit of A.J. McClellan said that Alex reached out to touch the chimpanzee. The deposition of Alex Grace disagreed with this.
But in those affidavits you reviewed for today's trial, several eyewitnesses reported seeing Alex Grace reach out and try to touch that chimpanzee. Isn't that right?
I believe 2 of the 4 did, yes.
And in 2 of those 4, they reported seeing that movement after the chimpanzee started screaming.
That's correct. So that would have been after the startle reaction began, and that could have been the perceived threat.
Exactly. That movement could have been the perceived threat. Isn't that right?
It could have, sure.
No further questions.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May this witness step down?
Certainly.
And, Your Honor, may I move the demonstrative out from the well?
You may.